coil pot demonstration. I'm just going to go through some techniques and how to use coils, which is a really traditional way to make pots. It's used to make little pots, it's used to make really large pots, and it's one of another more simpler method to construct any type of vessel shape you want. We can use the coil method to construct symmetrical functional vessels, asymmetrical sculptural vessels, so it's a really versatile technique, and once you understand the concept behind the method, you'll be able to apply it in a lot of different ways throughout the semester. So first, what I want to start out with is I got my clay here. A couple tools you're going to need. You're going to need a board. I like to use these decorator's wheels. This is a really nice tool that will help with the construction process. It's not necessary, but it's definitely something that I like to use. Perhaps you'll need a rolling pin. I usually don't use rolling pins, but I have them available. And then I'll also have one of these serrated kidney tools here that will help with kind of bonding the coils together. And I just have a couple of other tools here just in case I need them. It's a really simple process, and you'll see that when I teach you guys how to do things, I like to try to be as simple as possible, and then allow you guys to bring in tools or whatever you want to according to your particular process. So with that said, what I want to do is just go over a couple of things about bonding real quick. You can see I've got this piece of clay here, and what you're going to run into with this particular project is how you're going to determine the bonding of these clay pieces, right? So one of the things that can happen is if you don't get a really good bond between your coils, then cracks can appear, and those cracks can appear during drying or during firing. So you really want to make sure that you get a really, really good bond. There's a couple of different ways to bond material, and you can use what's known, a physical bond, like directly kind of smearing and combining the material together. So if you see, I've got these two coils right here, all right? And what I can do is I can compress them together, and then with my fingers, I can bond these together, all right? And I'll want to bond both sides, all right? And what will occur is you'll see right here, okay? Those coils are really bonded together really well. I won't be able to pull them apart, all right? And now they've been joined as one particular piece, okay? So that's kind of one way to bond, where you can literally smush and smear the clay together. It's a great way to do it. There's also another method. As you can see here, I've got what's called slip. This material is basically more of a liquid version of this clay body right here. It's just really watered down. In order to make slip, you can't just add water to clay. That's not really how it works. What happens is you need to dry out the clay totally, and then if you submerge that dried clay into water, it will slake down, and then you can mix that up and it will create more of a consistency like pudding or sour cream or something like that. That's the consistency that I like to use. And basically what this does, all right, is it will bond these two pieces together without having to smear them, right? So it's kind of like a glue, basically. And you'll be using this throughout the semester. It's hard to get away from. But what you can do is, if I take these two coils, okay, let me move this. you can take these two coils and you can bond them together. So if I take this right here, okay, and I kind of smear some slip on there, and then what I'd want to do is just attach the other side and compress them together, and you can see I get like a really tight bond. All right. Now the bond isn't, you know, isn't really strong right now. What's going to happen is after the material stiffens up and becomes more homogeneous throughout the entire vessel, it will bond it like glue. So you have to be patient. The other kind of downfall with using this type of method in constructing coil pot vessels is that you're adding a lot of moisture into the clay, which will then reduce its strength, and gravity will begin to take over, and it might pull it down, or your vessels might sag. That's technically, you're going to run into that regardless of whenever you're building clay pots. Gravity is always an issue. So as you become more familiar with the clay, with, you know, the relationship between the thickness of your clay wall, the vessel shape itself, and how that relates to gravity, you'll be able to make better choices in your construction process. So if I could just back up for just a quick second, when I talk about vessel shapes and gravity and the strength and survivability during the construction, if you have vessel shapes that are more, you know, cylindrical or vertical or consistent in shape, you can build those really high before gravity begins to pull, begins to pull down. If you are trying to create a really wide vessel, you know, something with a lot of form into it, you have to be really careful and watch, because it, you know, as clay becomes more horizontal, it becomes a lot weaker. And so if you're constructing a vessel that you want a lot of volume, typically what I'll suggest is that you create a cylinder first, and then you use pressure to kind of push that, you know, the clay wall out and create that form. If you're going to use just the coil method, you know, and realign your coils, okay, you do have to be careful in that you might need to allow your material to stiffen up before you continue, you know, a really wide shape. So there's also a relationship in thickness. So if your material is really thin, then obviously, and if it's thin and soft, then obviously gravity will have an effect as relation to something that's, you know, maybe the same softness but thicker, right? So there's these relationships between thickness, between softness, between the trajectory of the form and gravity itself. So you'll just want to pay attention to that, get used to it. You know, don't be afraid to mess up. It's fine. We just re-wedge the clay and make another pot. I'm going to show you how I typically use the coil method. I'm really fond of the process related to throwing on the wheel, which is where we make a cylinder first and then we expand our form. So that's typically how I do it. Okay, so we'll just begin. Now, one of the things that's really important is when you're constructing a vessel, you always want to start out with a base, okay? It's just like building a home or you know, some sort of building. You always start with a foundation, okay? And so what we need to do, always step one in any hand building construction, is to build the floor, okay? And so what I'll do, I've got this piece of wedged clay. You always use wedged clay. And I'm just going to start out by kind of compressing this material. I want to make sure that I don't have any cracks. I want to make sure that my material is consistent in thickness. I don't want to have anything that tapers, okay? If you have inconsistency in your clay walls, for example, if you go from like thick to thin to thick in the same clay wall, the thin area will dry faster and contract faster and therefore create a lot of tension, and you can get cracks. So you want to make sure that all of your material is really consistent in thickness as best you can. Alright, so what I like to do is when I'm making my vessel shape, or my base, excuse me, is I like to drag and stretch my, my slabs. It's just my methodology. I encourage you to practice that and get used to it. You can use a rolling pin. You can just kind of start from the center. If you decide to use a rolling pin, you want to make sure that you're constantly rotating it so that you're stretching it out in a really even manner. For me, I just like to, I'll just kind of drag it. So I don't throw it straight down. I'll just kind of, you know, drag it. And this particular method takes a little bit of practice. You're just going to have to get used to it. But what I like to do is I'll stretch it in all directions. So I'll rotate it, as you can see, and stretch it off into this direction here. Okay, so I don't want to get it too thin. And a good starting point is something that's roughly, roughly, like a quarter of an inch to like 3/8, or I don't know how many centimeters that is, 3 to 5 or something like that. You don't need it too terribly thick, but you certainly don't want it too thin. For example, excuse me, when you're learning this method, like something like this would be too thin. I wouldn't encourage you to do that until you've gained some experience with the process. And when you begin to understand how clay reacts. So something that's right around a quarter of an inch, a half of an inch is way too thick. You don't need that much material. But something around a quarter, to like a 3/8. All right. The other thing I want you guys to think about is I'm intending for you to create symmetrical vessels. I want you to practice your symmetry first. That will develop control. Before we talk about, more asymmetrical or sculptural vessel shapes. So for this first demonstration, I'm going to create a consistent cylinder and then show you how to expand it into basically like a simple vase shape. Excuse me. So what I'm going to do first is I've got this board here, and I want to build my pot on a board. You don't necessarily have to, but I prefer to. I'm also going to use a piece of paper or something. I've got scrap paper throughout the studio, so you can always just go get a piece of scrap paper. What that will do is when I put this slab on top of my board, this piece of paper will allow me to pick it up. Sometimes if you're like pushing on your material, it will stick to the wood, and then you won't be able to get it off until it totally dries. So this just allows for a little bit more movability and preventing it from sticking. The other thing that I like to do is use some sort of circle as my base. This is a little bit too wide, so I usually like to use a lid or something like that. Anything that's circular. I've got a whole bunch of circles throughout the studio. You can just find something, but this will just kind of help, as you can see here. All right, I just put the circle kind of right in the center, and then I can use my trusty knife here and cut a perfect base. All right, and there we go. Okay, and so now I've got this really consistent surface to build upon. All right, there we go. You can see. Okay, the next thing that I want you guys to consider is that you've got all this material here. This is still really good material, so I want to make sure that you guys aren't wasting it. So anything that you cut away that's still really soft, you can wedge back up and use it for your coils. So typically what I would suggest is that perhaps you have like a piece of plastic or something that you cover your clay with, and that will keep it really soft and pliable. What I want to do now is I want to start constructing my vessel, and so I've got my base here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to build on top of my base. Okay, This is kind of an important concept to understand that, okay, if I have this base, I want to make sure that I build on top, okay, right, rather than to the side, all right, because right now what's going on is if I build to the side, if I bond my coils, right, to the side of my base, then there's the ability for it to shear and fall apart, right? It can just, the floor can just kind of fall right through. But if I build on top, all right, that's a much stronger bond in that I would have to break the base in order for the pot to crack apart, right? So you always want to build on top of the base, the slab of the base. So I also, what I want to do is, before I get to that, I got to back up and show you guys how to make coils. It's generally pretty easy. You want to make sure that you've got a clear table, that you don't have any type of debris or anything that can contaminate your coil. And you'll see what I'll do is I'll start out and just kind of like rotate it and squeeze it. There certainly are a lot of different ways to make coils, but the easiest way is you want to make sure that you've got a reasonable amount of material to work with. Anything that's like too large, it can kind of get out of control. The other thing too is that you don't want to overwork your coils so that they get really stiff. You want to be able to keep them pliable. So this part of the process you want to be efficient at. The other thing to consider is that like your hands can pull moisture from the clay, the table will pull moisture from the clay. So the more that you're working it, the less pliable it can become. I can stretch coils, so like I can stretch them like this and create a pretty consistent coil. If I'm making like a really large pot where I need like a really big thick coil or something, that's probably how I do it. But for these small little pots or whatever, I'll just kind of roll my coil, and what I'll do is I'll use my hands and I'll roll the coil and I'll move my hands outward like this, and what that does is it actually stretches the material, and that will help create a consistent thickness. You want to try and create a pot with consistent clay walls by using consistent thicknesses in your coils. So you definitely want to watch for that, all right? You want to be able to get used to that. You don't want to use like a thin coil for one level and then a really thick coil. That will create inconsistencies, and that could lead to cracking or warping later on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll out a couple coils here, all right? And, something that's, kind of between, like a half inch or a quarter of an inch, something in that area, okay? You don't want to overthink it. The best thing to do is just, it's just to start constructing things. As you make more pots, you'll be able to make better decisions. So I've got a coil that's something like this. That's pretty good to start with. Because I want to build a cylinder first and then stretch it out, I am going to need some thickness so that when I stretch out the volume, there's enough material to actually stretch it out with, right? If I start with too thin of a coil and I want to create a lot of volume, then there's not going to be enough material there to actually stretch it out, right? It'll get too thin or it'll crack. So there's definitely a relationship there that you got to get used to. All right, so now that I've got this coil, what I want to do to make sure that I have a really good bond with my base is I'm just going to take the serrated tool and I'm going to make a, you can see right here, I'm going to make these like little grooves. That's called scoring, and what I'll do is I'll add slip, and the slip will get into these like little grooves here and really bond it. Alright, so I'm just going to take my trusty slip brush here and apply some slip to the outer edge. And you don't necessarily have to do this. Like, you could compress your coil and get a really good bond into the base. But I just think, with beginners and I always do this. It just adds a little bit of extra security. There's nothing worse than building a pot and then when it dries the base pops off. That's like a disaster. So this is just a little extra security. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start, and you can see how my little decorator's wheel becomes really efficient. And what I want to do, excuse me, is I want to make sure that because I want to build a cylinder, I want to make sure that I'm applying or connecting my coils in a straight cylinder shape. Okay, this part of the process you can get really out of control with your shape. All right. The other thing too is that I'm also pinching these coils together, right, so that I try to create a really nice bond as I construct, the cylinder itself. You can see right in here, all right, that I've got all this extra slip. All right, so what I'm going to do is just kind of clean that up with my finger. Just clean that up. All right, and now I've got this, really nice interior spot. All right, so something to just think about here. You can see how when I applied these coils, it's in a straight line. All right, what you don't want to do is excuse me, is start applying coils. If I think about how I stack these coils, I want to make sure that they're on top of each other. All right? If I start applying and stacking these coils, these layers of coils, where they're either out to the outside of the center, then what that will do is that will create a trajectory that will expand. All right, so what I want to be careful of is, because I'm trying to create a cylinder, I want to make sure that I stack my coils on top of each other, right? So right on that line of symmetry, right down the center of each coil. That will help keep a straight line. If I stack these like a little bit to the outside, right, that will create a curve, right? That'll start to create a trajectory going outwards, which I don't want to do. I want to stay away from at this particular moment because that could create a weakness and the pot could collapse. However, that is an advantage if you are trying to create, a really large vessel and you're used to the method. Then you can start pushing out your vessel forms just by how you stack your coils. The opposite is true if I go to the inside. I can create a trajectory that's going inward. That's a really advantageous way to help create form as you're building with your coils. So just keep that in mind. So I am going to continue to make coils here. And you can see I'm just kind of creating these coils as I go. And what I want to do first is I want to get enough of a vessel shape before I start applying my form. So I'm going to build this cylinder up to about 8 to 10 inches before I start making form. So here I go. I'm just going to... Now I don't need to apply slip to this layer. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of compress it together and continue to build. And you can see, like, I'm not really wasting any time here, right? Like, I'm trying to build a pot, right? I don't want to spend all day, thinking about, am I laying this down perfectly or not? Like, I want to build a pot. Okay, so now what I've got a pretty good size here, and so what I want to do now is I want to make sure that I bond all these coils together. And there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can use tools, or I like to use my fingers. The other thing too is you want to make sure that you can keep the cylinder wide enough so that you can fit your hand down in there. And so you want to make sure that you bond the exterior, and I'll bond right from the, if you can see that, I'm just kind of using my fingers, and that creates a really nice bond there. And I want to make sure I get all the coils, and you can go in different directions. So I usually start with the exterior first, all right, and then I'll move to the interior. Okay, so I bonded the exterior pretty well. Maybe I'll just use this tool just to kind of clean things up. Now this is just, I'm just kind of roughing things out, right? Like, you know, what we learned from the pinch pots is that you can kind of rough out a shape, and then as your vessel stiffens up, you can go back in and refine that shape. So, you know, you can use a similar strategy here. Now, I am going to use my fingers on the inside and get a really nice bond. But I also want to start expanding this out. The other thing that you want to watch for is how the vessel shape itself stays consistent. Like you can see right here how the vessel shape is starting to kind of go in and then out, right? So I actually want to fix that. I want to try and keep this straight and consistent, because what I want to do is create a vessel shape that kind of expands and then shoulders back in. So I'm going to use my serrated tool, okay? And what I'm going to do is these serrations here, all right, that will comb the clay. All right, and what that will do is it will create a really nice bond on the interior. And then I can also use it to expand my pot. Okay, there we go. I made my pot a little bit too narrow for my hand, so I'm just going to expand it out a little bit. All right, and once I start expanding it, then I'll be able to fit my hand in there a little bit better. And there we go, perfect. And you can see, as I'm compressing it and combing the material into my hand, right, like I'm counterbalancing that pressure, that force with the palm of my hand on the exterior, that will help create a consistent shape. And you can see that I continue to rotate my vessel. And what that will do is, as I expand the profile into one area of the pot, as I rotate it, I will continue that profile the whole way around the pot, right? That's what will help keep my symmetry. So if you think about this as being in levels, okay, level here, a level here, if you think about these horizontals, right, they're circles, okay? And if you think about the fact that each, horizontal circle, the way it either expands as you build up or contracts, that will create a consistent shape. And so that's kind of how you want to think about it. Like each horizontal, right, is a circle, all right? And if you have a consistent central axis and you're constantly comparing that circle, right, that's how the change in the profile, the change in the diameter of that circle, that's how you'll be able to measure the consistency of the symmetry in your shape. And so that's what I'm constantly doing. I'm just constantly evaluating the shape. I'm looking for cracks. Any type of crack I see, I want to fill it in, right? So you can see right here, okay, there's a crack. So I just kind of want to fill that in. That's going to happen. You're going to expose some of the coils, all right? This is also just one kind of technique. There are techniques where potters will use like a stone and a paddle, and they'll paddle against the stone on the inside or some sort of, smooth object that's round. And they'll paddle that, and you can use that compression as a way to expand the pot or shape the pot, and that will also bond it. This, for our studio right here, this is just a really simple method of bonding coils. So again, there's all sorts of different techniques. and you'll be exposed to those techniques. And you're welcome to experiment with them if you want. But again, I try and show you methods that you can use where, perhaps you don't have access to tools, or, sometimes your hands are the best tools that you can choose. So, all right. So I'm just going to continue to shape this pot. And make sure that I get really good bonds. So now that I kind of roughed out my shape here, I don't really want this texture, and I want to smooth it out on the interior. And so what I can do is I can use this smooth and rounded kidney tool here. It's just this metal tool. They can be wood, they can be, whatever. I'm just going to scrape this really consistent and put kind of like my final shape into it. I want to make sure it's smooth on the inside, because if I want to use this, as like a utilitarian vessel, where if I'm putting water or something into it, I want to make sure that it's got a smooth and consistent interior. And that will just kind of help the ability to clean it out. And, it just makes it a little bit more functional. So what I'm doing now is I'm smoothing out the base, the interior of the base. And so first what I've done is I've evaluated my form with like a vertical motion, all right? And now I'm using the tool. See the profile of the tool? I can use that as a vertical, right? And a horizontal swipe, and that might help put this profile into the side of my pot. And just try to like make things a little bit more consistent. All right, and now what I want to do is I want to start finishing it. So I want to coil this pot in to kind of make like a bottle type shape, and then put a rim on it. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that I'm starting all out with like a level starting point. And so I'm just going to kind of create like a little line here and just, make a cut. Kind of start from more of a level, more consistent surface. There we go. Okay, now I've got a little bit of a thin spot here. It's pretty inconsistent, so I am going to beef that up a little bit with my next coil. I'll put a thicker coil here, and then I'll smear it down, and that'll just kind of help make it a little bit more consistent. All right, the other thing too that I want to consider is that I want to think about how I place my coils. So instead of keeping them vertical, right, I'm going to start placing them kind of in, and that will create this, this like curving profile. After completing the overall form, I'm looking to finish off the vessel by incorporating a rim. I construct a rim by stretching it across the table and cutting an edge to the bottom to connect it to the top of the vessel. I use slip
to make sure I achieve a secure connection with the vessel. Once the rim is attached, I compress the rim against the top of the vessel to make sure there aren't any gaps. The final step is to add a handle. I use the same method to construct a handle as I did for the rim, so that there'll be a unifying design element between the two parts. This will create similar visual design characteristics that will help unify the overall design of the pot. It will also serve a functional purpose in allowing you to pick up the jug.
I'm just going to put a finishing touch on here. I'm going to cut a nice beveled edge into my pot, and that will work really well with the glazing process. And so perhaps what I'll do is I'll let this stiffen up and then maybe make a couple more modifications later. And there we go. That's our coil method. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing what you guys produce in the studio. Okay, catch you later.